Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Spence webinar for employers in local government pension schemes. I'm Alistair Russell-Smith, and I head up the charity and not-for-profit practice here at Spence. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues Rachel Graham and Sean Campbell as well. Apologies, I'm just trying to move on the slide. There we go. Why we're here today and why we're talking about this? Well, there's two reasons. First reason is that the Scottish local government pension schemes issued their triennial valuation results fairly recently. You should have had those in the last couple of months. So now is just a natural time to be reviewing LGPS participation and your options. But also secondly, and perhaps more interestingly, we'll come on to this, but the funding position of LGPS schemes has improved dramatically over the last 2 years. And that's opening up opportunities for employers that perhaps weren't there 2 years ago, including in some cases accessing surplus payments back from LGPS funds. So it's a really interesting time to be understanding your options and assessing the way forward. Just in terms of the session today, this is the second session we've run, so you're an exclusive group here that are dialing into the second one. Rachel, Sean and myself have got about 30 minutes of content that we'll run through, and we'll leave time at the end for questions. You should be able to see a Q&A button on your ribbon at the top. If you just click on that, you can ask any questions you like. These are not being published for everyone, so everyone to see, so that they'll just come through to Rachel, Sean and myself. So ask away whatever question you like, and we'll try and deal with it either as we go at the end, or failing that, we'll come back to you afterwards. So just in terms of what we'll be covering, you can see on screen here. So Sean, I'll hand over to in a second. He's going to run us through the landscape in LGPS in Scotland and explain these funding improvements I mentioned and why they've come about. We'll then hear from Rachel, who's going to talk about some of the different terminology that you may or may not be familiar with in LGPS in terms of different ways of measuring the liabilities, different types of contributions. And then hand back to me to just run through the options you'll have as an employer in LGPS and pros and cons and what you should be thinking about. I think that is all the introductory stuff. So let's get on with the material. Sean, what's going on in LGPS land in Scotland?
Thanks, Alistair. This slide that we're showing on screen sets the scene for much of what we're going to cover in this presentation. So the table shows the funding level for the 11 LGPS funds across Scotland at the 2020 actuarial valuation date. The results shown are on a prudent or cautious basis, referred to probably in most of the reports that you'll have come across as the ongoing basis. So as you can see, the funding level across all funds at 2020 was relatively good, with funding levels all over 90% on the ongoing basis. And in aggregate across all the funds, the funding level was 104%. So the more prudent or cautious a basis is, the higher the resulting liability will be for the fund. At the 2020 valuation date, the Government Actuaries Department estimated that the aggregate funding level on a best estimate basis or a less cautious basis was 129%. So the next few slides set out changes in market conditions over recent times and the implications for the LGPS funds in Scotland, which is ultimately, as Alistair alluded to, a further significant improvement in funding level at the 2023 valuation date. So the chart on the next slide shows the return on a few different asset classes since 31 March 2020. So the top two purple and blue lines represent global equities and UK equities. As the chart shows, these assets have had very strong returns since 2020, increasing by up to 50% by 31 March 2023. So any funds with a considerable holding in equities are likely to have seen a significant rise in their assets at 31 March 2023, all else being equal. The bottom green line represents index-linked bonds. As you can see, they have had contrasting returns since 31 March 2020 compared to equities, reducing by approximately 35%. The next slide will add a bit more detail to this, but liabilities are broadly linked to gilt or interest rates, so there's been a significant reduction in the overall fund liabilities. So these two combined effects, an increase in assets, assuming that they're broadly in line with equities, and a reduction in liabilities, assuming they're broadly linked to gilts or interest rates, has led to funding level improvements of approximately 30 to 40% between 2020 and 2023. So the chart we have here shows the change in gilt yields since 2020, since 2008, sorry. As you can see, there's been quite a dramatic change in gilt yields, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, where they have gone from gilt yields of roughly 0.5% in 2020 to rates of about 4.5% more recently. So what we're also seeing with the current market conditions is gilt yields back to levels seen pre-2007-2008 financial crisis, and arguably they're back to more normalized long-term levels. So what does this mean for your pension scheme? Gilt yields are predominantly used in the derivation of the discount rate assumption. So when gilt yields rise and the discount rate subsequently increases, all else being equal, this will act to reduce the value of your liabilities. So putting all this together, here is an illustration of how we expect your funding levels to have moved from 2020. As touched on earlier, the funding level for LGPS schemes in Scotland was around 100% on an ongoing basis in 2020. Since then, we have seen an increase in assets such as equities, increasing the value of your scheme assets, and an increase in gilt yields, reducing the value of your scheme liabilities, such that we expect funds to be sitting with funding levels closer to 130 or possibly 140% now on an ongoing basis. So that's a very kind of quick overview of it over the last few years and where we expect funds to be sitting now.
Great, thanks, Sean. Actually, let's just take a question that's come in that's relevant to this stuff. So, asking about contribution rates that you've seen in Scottish LGPS funds. What insights have you got there, Sean?
I think it from what we've seen, it's been varying across the different funds. So in some cases, employer contributions are being reduced down to 7% to match the employee contributions for a 2-year period. And in other cases, I think funds are still offering a reduction, but it's more in the region of around 20% in employer contributions. So there's still a bit of a range across the different funds.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that, Sean. There is quite a range out there, and also there are levers that can impact on those contribution levels. So it's worth understanding what they are and how much flex there might be in some of those contributions, even if they are lower than they have been. Great. Okay, let's move on to some of that terminology. Rachel, can you explain this slide to us, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Alistair. So your organisation's liabilities in the fund are measured on a variety of different bases, and some of the names of the bases you might recognise on this slide from seeing in the valuation correspondence that you will have had from the fund. So the ongoing basis, this is the triennial actuarial valuation basis, and legislation requires this to be a prudent basis. The expected return on the scheme's assets will be taken into account when setting the discount rate to use. And this is the basis that's used to calculate future pension contributions, assuming continuing participation in the fund. On the other hand, the FRS 102, or the accounting basis, it's used each year to assess the value of pension liabilities for accounting purposes, and these liabilities are calculated using a prescribed basis set by the accountancy profession. This basis uses a discount rate that's based upon good quality usually AA-rated corporate bonds of a duration which is equivalent to that of the scheme's liabilities. And currently we're seeing these bases are likely to be quite similar in strength to your ongoing basis, therefore resulting in similar levels of liabilities and a similar deficit. As this valuation is undertaken every year, the results can be quite volatile from one year to the next. The cessation basis is the basis that is used by your fund to calculate your liabilities on the assumption that you're exiting the fund, and it is a very prudent basis. The discount rate used often removes any allowance for asset outperformance over gilts and is typically set based on the gilt yield at the date of exit. Hence, the liabilities measured on this basis are usually much higher than the value of the liabilities on an ongoing or an FRS basis. It's also worth at that point touching on guarantees, and it's worth understanding whether or not you have a guarantee in place from your council, as this could be quite valuable. A guarantee changes a few aspects of how your liabilities are measured in the fund. If you do have a guarantee in place, your ongoing funding position will be calculated using a more favourable ongoing basis, which is less prudent than the ongoing basis that would be used by the fund for an employer who doesn't have a guarantee. And if you have a guarantee in place, that favourable ongoing basis would be used by the fund to calculate your exit liabilities, and any surplus above that guarantee level would be refunded to the employer on exit. If you don't have a guarantee from your council, your exit liabilities will be calculated on the very prudent cessation basis, and you're more likely to have a surplus on your ongoing basis in comparison to your cessation basis. But it is still possible to obtain a surplus credit back from your employer on exit, even if you don't have a guarantee, especially then, or that will happen if your cessation funding position turns out to be positive. On the next slide then, we've set out here a bit of detail around the contributions that your organisations pay to the fund, and you'll see the contributions really can be made up of 3 different components. You might recognise some of these references as well from your last valuation results correspondence that the fund would have sent you. Primary contributions are the annual. This is the annual contribution rate required to fund future pension accrual for active members. Secondary contributions are contributions required to fund any past service deficit that you might have in the fund. And given the significant recent improvement in funding levels on an ongoing basis that Sean referred to, it's likely that the level of secondary contributions you might be seeing are nil or even negative for a number of organisations. The exit contributions, this is the deficit on a cessation basis that's payable when your organisation ceases to have any active members in the fund, or which is payable when your organisation leaves the fund. Some organisations that we've worked with recently have exited the fund and actually had an exit credit as they were in surplus on a cessation basis. Just on to the next slide then. Oh, sorry, Alistair.
Yep, no, sorry, there you go.
Great. Here, what we're just really pointing out here, I suppose, the importance of considering the timing of any exit from the fund, if that is something that your organisation is considering, especially given the favourable improvements in the funding levels that we've seen recently. Currently, we're seeing funding levels on an exit or cessation basis at the highest levels that we've ever seen in years. And we've recently supported organisations through an exit process where the value of their liabilities on the exit basis was lower than their share of the fund's assets, which resulted in them receiving an exit credit payment from the fund, rather than being faced with an unaffordable exit deficit, as we had seen for some organisations in the past. Funding levels can be extremely volatile, and depending on how financial markets move in the future, we could see deficits on exit bases emerging again in the future. You may therefore wish to consider the timing of an exit from the fund if exiting is part of your organisation's objectives, or if you have a falling number of active members in the scheme. Handing back to you, Alistair, I think at that point.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And actually, let's just address another question that's come in. So just on cessation exit credits, Rachel, what sort of amounts have you seen with the clients you've worked with on that?
Yeah, we've seen a really broad range of credit payments that employers have had back from the fund. They've ranged from a couple of £100,000 in some cases. And actually one recent case where the refund was £2 million.
Yeah, okay, some quite big numbers there then, aren't there?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's really helpful background there from Rachel and Sean. I'm just going to explain now what your options are as an employer in LGPS. So you can see on screen 4 options there, which I'll just walk you through. So Option one is carry on doing what you're doing, carry on participating in that fund. In the short term, that's going to generate cash savings, so that's helpful and attractive. As we've already mentioned, as Sean was explaining, we are seeing quite a range of employer contributions across different funds in Scotland as the valuation results come through, ranging from anything from sort of 7% contribution rates up to 20% plus. So if you are concerned about the contributions that are being proposed by the fund, they don't come until the 1st of April, so you still have some time to understand what the levers are that are driving those contribution rates and understand if there's any ability to adjust those rates at all. So that's well worth looking at. The big issue with carrying on, which we've been talking about, is that you are, in most cases, if you're a closed group of staff in LGPS, you are on an inevitable time horizon to exit, at which point that cessation debt will trigger, and you're therefore exposed to that future funding volatility if you stay in. So yes, the favourable funding position we're in at the moment might remain, but clearly there's a risk deficits re-emerge and potentially you can't exit with the level of favourable terms that you can at the moment. So you're then into sort of different flavors of exit options. So 2 and 3 are both okay. Let's sort of take some control of this, and rather than just carrying on and paying the exit debt when the last active leaves, let's actually sort of force that exit now by and we'll come on to how you have to do this, removing your remaining staff from the scheme and triggering that exit. And you'll then either be in deficit or surplus on that cessation basis, which takes you down to either option 2 or option 3, respectively. So if you were in deficit, and I mean, it's worth saying a lot of charities aren't anymore, they will be in surplus, but some are still in deficit, you're down option 2. One useful thing here is that some of the funds in Scotland are offering guaranteed terms on exit debts. So an age-old problem has been that you don't know what the actual amount will be that you have to pay until after you've pressed the button to exit. But we do now have mechanisms around that. Quotes are guaranteed for 60 days in some cases, so make sure you get that, and then at least you go into that with cost certainty. And the default will ordinarily be that you pay that debt, that lump sum, up front. But if that is unaffordable, there are what are called debt spreading arrangements available. So this is where you still exit, you still crystallize that debt. You arguably lock into pretty favorable market conditions at the moment, but rather than paying it all up front, you spread it over time. The time horizons on that can vary, and sometimes, particularly for longer ones, you may be asked to provide security if it's available to sort of back that credit risk, that default risk that the fund has. But this is a relatively common option that is available and is worth understanding, particularly if paying that initial debt in one lump sum is unaffordable. Another option is called a deferred debt arrangement. That's a slightly different flavour. So this is where you cease accruing in the fund, but rather than crystallising your exit debt now, you carry on participating on an ongoing basis. So you pay those secondary contributions that Rachel was talking about. You remain exposed to that funding volatility and the risks of costs increasing in the future. But also you may hopefully be in a position where funding improves and you can then move into paying any exit debt when that exit cessation position has improved. So that's the different flavors if you've got a deficit on exit. Like I've said, there's actually quite a few employers and charities now finding themselves in surplus on an exit position, which takes you down option 3. So yeah, it's a very clear policy in Scottish LGPS funds that if you are in surplus on that cessation basis, then the employer gets that surplus payment back from the fund. As I said, we'll come on to sort of how you trigger this exit, but clearly it will impact on the employees that you still have accruing pension in the fund, and we're seeing some nice win-wins here to help ease that change for staff. So using some of that surplus to improve member benefits and offset the impact of exiting the fund for them. So as an example, with the consent of the funds, you can buy added years pension benefits in the fund for the affected staff, use some of that surplus to mitigate the impact on member benefits there. So looking for those win-wins is quite a helpful thing to do in this situation. And the last thing we just wanted to raise is that there are a range of different policies out there for both cessation calculations and exit policies. So you do need to just understand what that policy is for your fund and if it is likely to change or under review in the future. There are different methods out there that we're seeing from different funds and different advisors. Some examples include what are termed cessation corridors. So rather than having a sort of one line, and if you're above that line, you get everything back up to the line. And if you're below the line, you pay a debt. Instead, having a broader corridor whereby if you're in the corridor, you don't have to pay a debt to get out, but also you don't get a surplus payment back unless you're above the top of the corridor. So that can actually potentially make it a bit harder to access a surplus for employers. And some other approaches as well, which are over time are starting to increase the bar for getting back exit credits. The last option we just wanted to touch on is partial cessation. So this is an interesting new option. It's not being used widely at the moment, but it is being talked about. And so it's worth discussing with your fund if you fall into this category. And this category is one whereby, for whatever reason, you decide that the HR implications, the implications on affected staff of exiting are simply too much. Then with a partial cessation, what you can do is settle the position for your deferreds and your pensioners, and remain participating in the fund for your active employees. So it's pretty common to see, if the liabilities that a charity might have in local government pension schemes, that perhaps 50-60% of those liabilities relate to former employees, deferreds, and pensioners, and it's actually quite a small amount that remains linked to actives. So this approach potentially enables you to access or settle the vast majority of your liability, shrink the size of your remaining risk, and potentially still access exit credits on those deferreds and pensioners whilst carrying on participating for active. So as I say, it's a newly emerging solution, not widely used at the moment, but is worth considering if you fall in that bucket. So if you are in that situation of wanting to exit and go down option 2 or 3 that we were just talking about, then how do you do that? Well, there is this pension change that will occur for your employees that are in the local government pension fund. We've found, working with our clients, using this 4-stage process on the screen here has been helpful. So just talking through each of those stages. The first stage, develop that proposal. And there's a few different things to think about here. Certainly the contractual position is important. So thinking about the employees' contracts of employment, do they hard code participation in the local government pension scheme, for example, in which case you might need their agreement to any change, or maybe they just say you're eligible for a pension, which gives you a bit more flexibility in the change process with staff. You need to think about and this will typically be a defined contribution pension that you put in place for the affected employees. Most organisations will already be offering DC for other staff. So in terms of thinking about the DC to offer the LGPS employees, the starting point is, well, what are our existing staff getting for DC? But refining that proposal and settling on a pension amount there is necessary. You then need to think about some non-pension items as well. So local government pension schemes do provide some other non-pension benefits. So life cover. So if an individual dies whilst employed, they get a lump sum benefit from the fund. And if they become ill, they can take or become eligible for an ill health early retirement from the fund as well. Those items would be lost through a change like this, so you need to consider replacing those, and how you replace those. You can buy insurance for both of those types of benefits, so consider that. And a nice little sort of winner that you can put to staff here is salary sacrifice as well. So this is not possible in local government pension schemes, but it's very standard, and you may already be offering it for any other employees you have in DC. And this is whereby you agree with your staff that they will reduce their salary by the level of the pension contribution they would have otherwise made, and you as an employer pay that same amount into the pension scheme as an employer contribution instead. And what you achieve by doing that is savings on national insurance contributions, both for employees and for the employer. So it's effectively a sort of no cost way of improving members' benefits as part of this change. So it's quite a helpful thing to be able to offer as part of the change. So get that proposal developed. That normally takes 2-3 weeks, and then move on to stage 2, which is the staff communications. There's a question around whether or not a consultation is needed here with staff. Local government pension schemes don't fall under the standard pension consultation requirements, which apply to private sector schemes, but you may need to consult if you need staff agreement to these changes and you're effectively into an employment consultation situation. So to understand that position, that business case that you've developed in one, really crucial for these communications for staff. So helping them understand why you're proposing this is critical, even if they don't necessarily like the impact on themselves. Understanding the reason for the change and being able to see that, yeah, from an employer perspective, it makes sense is really valuable. And then get those communications done. And as well as written communications, we generally find it's very useful and helpful for staff to actually have a presentation, ideally face to face, but certainly on Teams, so that they can understand this and hear people and hear the senior management of the charity explaining what's going on and why it's being proposed. And lastly, personalized illustrations are pretty helpful. So these are illustrations that we do for some clients where we set out their pension, expected pension pre and post the changes, taking account of their own situations, their own salary, pensionable service, age, so they can really understand the impact of it on themselves. And these can be useful as well for actually showing that some people aren't as affected by these changes as they might have initially thought. So as an example, if someone is very close to retirement, they've actually already accrued the vast majority of their pension, and any reduction or change to their pension benefit just a few years from retirement has minimal impact on their overall pension. So run that communication process with staff and then make final decisions after that on what you're going to do. And you may at this point or during that consultation period with staff decide to refine the initial offer. We've just put up under phase 3 some different things that you can look at there in terms of refinements. So some of our clients offer access to an IFA for staff so that they can understand and get independent financial advice on the implications of it for them. You may decide to enhance the original pension offer, so for example, offer a higher level of DC. I touched on the last slide on sorry, just going to have a water. On using an exit credit to fund some extra years in the LGPS fund for affected employees. And last one, yeah, so people who are over 60, those who also have rule of 85 in LGPS, it might actually be in their interest to start drawing their LGPS pension and carrying on working. And by doing that, they're obviously ceasing accrual in that pension scheme as well. So you're therefore triggering that exit as well. So there's quite a few, like I say, win-win options there that can work quite well. And then you move on to implement. Implement's actually pretty straightforward, but implement, liaise with the fund, liaise with your DC provider, liaise with payroll, and just make those changes. And then you're done. You'll get that final exit debt or surplus back thereafter. that's the change. Sort of end to end, we typically recommend clients plan on it taking about three to 4 months to run through that process and trigger that exit. So that's largely done. Just to summarize and sort of key takeaways, you heard from Sean just how strong funding levels are in the LGPS at the moment. They're the highest levels we've seen in decades. This does mean there is an opportunity to exit now, potentially with an exit credit, and remove the risk of the positions deteriorating in the future and having to pay more cash in or having to pay an exit debt in the future. So really urging charities in LGPS to understand their options and decide what to do there. If you're in an exit credit position, look for those win-wins that we've talked about. If you're in a situation where this change is just going to cause too much of a problem for affected staff, then think about that partial cessations option and discuss that with your fund. As I say, plan for a 3 to 4 month timescale to implement that exit. Right, that's us done. There's 1 or 2 questions that have come in that we haven't discussed yet, so just picking those up. Rachel, a question here. I mean, I was covering it to some extent, but a question here on what have you seen employers do in terms of getting the staff agreement to this change and making sure they're compensated for the loss of LGPS?
What we've seen, I suppose we've seen a broad range of things, but it really comes down to what it says in the staff employment contracts, whether there is an entitlement to be enrolled in an LGPS or whether there's just a broader requirement to enroll staff in a pension scheme. And then, as you said, Alistair gives staff a bit more, or gives employers a bit more flexibility. But in terms of what we've seen employers offer staff an incentive in terms of an additional, maybe one-off monetary contribution to a new DC scheme that they may be placed into in place of the LGPS. We've seen a step up in employer rates of contributions for, say, the first 3 to 5 years for staff that used to be in LGPS that were then moved across to a DC arrangement. We've seen employers do nothing as well, and we've seen no incentives be provided, and staff perhaps being moved into a DC fund that is already in place for other employees of that organisation.
Yeah, so quite a range, isn't there, really? And like you say, often driven by the contractual position that staff have, and and also the sort of culture and ethos of the employer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's take one last question. So, Sean, a question here about how do I start assessing this and understanding my options? How can I get the information on this? What would your advice be there, Sean?
I think the starting point probably to kind of shape the conversations, we're probably looking at your most recent cessation valuation that you've received. That'll kind of hopefully give you a steer as to whether you're in a debt or a credit. I think once you have that information, you can start opening up a dialogue with the fund to kind of get the ball rolling in terms of getting an exit or getting yourself exited from the fund. And hopefully the presentation showed it, but if you need help or assistance with that, we can kind of help you with that. We can help you. We'll kind of sit on your shoulder essentially and guide you through the process to make it as easy and straightforward for you as possible.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Sean. Yeah, we're really happy to just have a call and have a look at any initial numbers and give you initial views on what might work for you and what might not. And one other thing just to look out for is if you have a March year end, which a lot of charities do, you'll be having your FRS 102 numbers coming through in April. So look out for those. They're quite an easy way to understand what the latest funding position is that you're in. Great. All right. Well, let's call it there. Rachel, Sean, thank you very much for participating in the webinar, and to all of you, I hope it was useful. Do get in touch if you've got any questions or follow up, and we'll leave it there. Have a good afternoon. Bye.